Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program, and it's once again a wonderful pleasure that EWTN gives me to join you to hear stories of conversion. And tonight our guest is Thomas Storck, former atheist, Episcopalian. We'll hear about that, and also just a couple of data up in front. His whole story was included as a collection in a book called Journeys Home 2 that the Episcopalian Network has published, and in case you're interested, you can get that, or go to our website, chnetwork.org, to find out more about that. But our guest is Thomas Storck. Wonderful. You all right, Thomas?
Yeah, fine.
Okay, well, there's water for you there if you need it, please. It's good to have you on the program, my friend.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Some of you, the audience, may know of you from your articles and your writings you've written on Catholic culture, and also on issues of economics and distributism. And
Right. My last book that came out a couple of years ago was called From Christian Neutral Americanism and Beyond. And I have another book coming out, the same publisher, later this year on Catholic social teaching, papal teaching.
you know that the book that you had come out recently is so important, and I'm glad you wrote that. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about later on, because people who only grew up with calculators, it's hard for them to compare what they have if they don't remember what it was like when all you had slide rules, or when all you need the comparison to help understand, appreciate where we're at. And that's what your book is looking back 300 years and where we've come to where we have to see where it was built and what we've lost along the way.
Right. It attempts to be a guide to Catholics really to understanding the modern world. The changes were profound, and if you only live on one side of the divide, you tend not to know, well, what was it like on the other side of the divide, and not realize how different it was and how profoundly it's affected the thinking of most Catholics.
Yeah, which is true in your own life, because you weren't always a Catholic, right?
No. I was raised in a home that I think was kind of unusual for the 1950s and early 60s, in the sense that my father was a religious skeptic. In fact, although he didn't like to use the term, he was in effect an atheist. He didn't think that that God was a person. I remember once he showed me Einstein's E equals mc squared, and he said, maybe that's God. But he believed very much in going to church. So we generally always went to church.
Culturally, is that his
Well,
conviction,
I think he thought it was a good social institution. So we went. I was born in Brooklyn, but I came to Ohio when I was a baby. So in the medium and small size Ohio towns we lived in, we went to various Protestant churches, mostly a matter of convenience. We went to. My father really considered himself a Unitarian, and for a while we went to a Unitarian fellowship in Canton, Ohio, but there were some strange people there, like flying saucer enthusiasts. My father didn't really have too much truck with them, so we didn't go for very long. I don't really know all the story of why we stopped going there. But in fact, for a while, my father even had church services in our home because he couldn't find a church that would satisfy him. But,
Oh, interesting.
But one thing I will say, even though it was kind of strange, my father religion was something in our family that was important. It was something you could talk about. It was something you could argue about. It was something you could read about and study about. It wasn't just something, I think there were a lot of Catholic families that, well, they went to church, they practiced the faith, they believed, but they never talked about the faith. It wasn't something you discussed. And so I think that's one of the reasons why some Catholics have fallen away, because it was not really a living thing. It was just something you did. But anyway, so I am grateful to my father for that he made religion something that was worth talking about.
Well, I'm thinking, why it is that people won't talk about their faith. I look back, my family, my dad sounds a lot like your dad, and we didn't talk about the faith at home, and I'm wondering, is that because we didn't know it well enough to discuss? But it makes me think about, in your environment, the freedom of talking about it helped you learn the faith, or at least learn the issues, probably as a young man, because of that openness.
Yeah, learning the importance of the faith. And my father had a large library, a personal library, and he had a large number of books on religion. In fact, that was the prayer books was what he liked collecting more than anything else, of any denomination, even non-Christians. So, as I'll mention in a minute, that stood me in very good stead after I started moving toward the faith. But when I was about, I think it was about fourth or fifth grade, we started going to the Episcopal Church because my father found it, well, the services were dignified. Nobody was going to try to save the soul. And it was a comparatively dignified intellectual experience compared with lots of versions of American Christianity. But I didn't believe it. And my father didn't expect me to believe it.
Yeah.
In fact, later on he was not pleased when I did start believing. But I unfortunately, when I was in the 7th grade, I was expected to undergo the Episcopal confirmation ceremony, and I didn't want to do it because I didn't believe it. But my father and my family kind of pressured me to do it, not because they thought it had any religious significance, but it was important to belong to a church, my father thought.
So he didn't believe in God, the reality of a God, but he saw the need for you going to the church because it was a good moral way of shaping your life, or
I think it was less that than just the social idea. Probably, if I had to guess, I would guess that when he grew up in the 20s and 30s, belonging to a church was so important that that impressed itself upon him very strongly, and so he stayed with him. But as it wasn't so much the moral teaching as anything he'd ever, just to belong, to have a social thing.
Again, that reminds me of my dad, who might have been the same age as yours. I remember when he got out of the war, World War II, as a young man. I look back on some of the data, and one of the first things he did was join a Lutheran church. I know my dad didn't believe. That wasn't a part of it. It's a history. Why? Social. He's a young man, 20s. How do you meet people? How do you have connection in the community? That's what it was for my dad, I imagine.
It sounds very similar. And of course, in the 1950s, as you probably know, there was ostensibly a great religious revival going on in the United States. A lot of it was just kind of sham, but it certainly increased the number of people who attended services, Protestants, and especially, I suppose. But anyway, when I was in junior high school, I had thought about the question of God a lot. I hadn't the slightest idea of how to investigate the question of was there a God. I mean, I never had any acquaintance with any of the arguments for the existence of God. It was more a matter of feeling, and it was just very, very immature. So I concluded that there was no God. This was about probably 8th or 9th grade. And so for a few years, I was an atheist. I don't claim that I was a very informed atheist, but I was an atheist according to probably appropriate to my age, as it were, if you will. And then in the summer before my junior year in high school, I came upon an article in some Episcopalian publication my parents received that said something about C.S. Lewis, and I don't think I'd ever heard of him before. But I saw, here's a man who was an intellectual, a scholar, and a believer. Maybe there's something to this. Maybe I should investigate it. So I started looking into it, and it wasn't really Lewis that was crucial here. It was a book that my father brought home by a Protestant. It was kind of an unusual book for him to bring home. It was a series of meditations by, I think he was a Methodist, actually. And he had some very rudimentary arguments for the existence of God. And I had never encountered anything like that before. I thought, yeah, that makes sense. I can see that. There is a God. And so...
Did it impress your dad?
Well, I didn't tell him right away.
Oh, okay.
No, he didn't.
So he hadn't read them, and
I don't know why he had the book. He kept it to his dying death. I have the book in my library right now, but he didn't. He was not moved by it. But I was profoundly moved by it. In a matter of seconds, I became a theist. Now, of course, being a theist is not the same as being a Christian.
Yeah.
And so a few months later, I was working part-time after school. A woman I was working with asked me, she was a Protestant, she asked me what my religious stance was, and I said, well, I believe in God, but I'm not a Christian. And she said, well, you should pray to God to show you the truth about his son, Christ. And I said, okay. So I started. And over the next several months, I was reading more C.S. Lewis, and I moved to a stance of accepting the Christian revelation as an Episcopalian. And there was no, I don't remember that course of events. I wish I did in detail. It's not a striking moment like the moment I came to believe in God. That was a very clear moment. The course of becoming a Christian was a more gradual one. But anyway,
Mere Christianity, was that a big
well,
one
I read
for
that.
you?
It was one of the things I read. I don't remember. The only thing I remember very, very decisively in that book, in that period of time rather, was C.S. Lewis's autobiography, Surprised by Joy.
Yeah.
He talks there about a playwright writing himself apart into his own play, and that helped me understand the idea of the incarnation a little bit, because I had not quite understood how God could be both in the world and yet created the world. So the idea of a playwright who writes apart for himself in his own play, that helped me understand that. So that's about the only concrete thing I remember that time. Well, when I was a baby, I had been, I don't know what it was, baptized, I think the certificate says christened, in the Unitarian Church in Brooklyn. And there was no, I don't know, there are some, in the East Coast there are a number of so-called high Unitarian churches that have liturgies and I don't know if they still exist or not, but at that time they did, in the early 50s. There's one in Boston, there's one in, I don't know how many there are. But anyway.
In fact, some of the preachers on those churches were quite world-renowned preachers. You know, what they were preaching was a bit questionable, but they were renowned as orators.
Yeah, I think that's true. But anyway, I was christened in this Unitarian church, and I knew enough to know that probably that baptism wasn't valid. It probably wasn't Trinitarian, although who knows what formula was used or what the intention of the minister was. So I knew I needed to get baptized, and that was a big deal in my family because, you know, it would have shown everybody I'm actually starting to believe this stuff, which I'm not supposed to believe. But I was too ignorant even to ask God for help. But he helped me anyway. And a few months later, I had the courage to ask our Episcopal rector about it and tell him I had probably never been baptized. So I was conditionally baptized in the Episcopal Church in July of, would have been 1968. And so then for about 10 years, I lived as an Episcopalian. And here I mentioned before my father's library and his many books about religion. And here, those books really, really helped me. He had a lot of not only Episcopal books, but he had a number of Catholic books. He had Ronald Knox's The Belief of Catholics. He had a book, he had Chesterton's The Everlasting Man. He had the Baltimore Catechism and the English Penny Catechism. And I read a lot of these books, and as well as some high church Episcopalian books. And I got from those books the sense that the Christian faith was not a matter of simply you believe the Bible, as if the Bible somehow fell down from heaven and everybody opened it up and said, hey, what's that? No, there was a church that Christ founded. It was a visible body. It had sacraments, it had discipline, it had doctrines, and so on. Now, a lot of high church Episcopalians believe this. It wasn't exactly a Catholic belief, but it was very similar in the sense that it recognized the church as a corporate body. And Ronald Knox, I remember, I read a lot of his belief of Catholics at the time, and he pointed out how, if you read the book of Acts in Scripture, the church is not like anything like the evangelical American idea of Christianity. You have a corporate body, the church. The church has rules, the church has officers, the church decides points of doctrine. And I could see that, yeah, this is really true, because I was reading the Bible at the time too. This is really true. So I never had that American Bible-only attitude towards Christianity. I thanks to these Catholic and Anglican authors, I totally bypassed that.
But your dad didn't know you were reading on the sly.
Well, I think he was beginning to get some idea, but he didn't really understand it very well until later. But he wasn't pleased with my course, that's for sure.
Our guest is Thomas Storck. So for 10 years you were kind of reading while an Episcopalian. Of course, Episcopalian church has got a wide breadth of where it's at theologically. Were you finding yourself drawing closer to use the word conservative, authentic Christianity in the midst of that time period?
Well, I was drawn toward the high church tradition. I don't like to use the word conservative in a theological sense, but it was certainly held to the historic doctrines of the church. And I went to as an undergraduate to an Episcopal college here in Ohio, Kenyon College, which is not far from here. And even though the atmosphere there was not Christian at all, either in doctrinally or in terms of morals, but reading these authors and C.S. Lewis too really helped me, so that I never had any serious questions of faith when I was in undergraduate or later in graduate school. I never had any, I could see through a lot of the arguments that the secularists made. C.S. Lewis is particularly good at this, at showing how a lot of the objections that people make to Christianity are just really stupid. And if you're forearmed with these things, you can just sort of laugh at the objections. Oh yeah, I've read that before. Nice. But I also, when I was an undergraduate, I got involved with a pan-Protestant, kind of evangelically oriented prayer group. But that helped me a lot. That helped me a lot in the sense of helping me to have a kind of a more personal relationship with our Lord, and help me give me moral support in resisting the kind of the immorality that was flooding the campus there in terms of sex and drugs and so on. That helped me to keep my distance from that somewhat.
I mean, there's the irony of the place where you went, at Kenyon, because it started out at a very religious school, and in fact, there's even a history of one of the presidents of Kenyon College at one time converted to the Catholic Church. And so there's a history.
Yes, James Kent Stone. Yeah, he became a priest, a Passionist priest.
Yeah. And while the school is losing its faith as an institution, you were in the midst of that, growing closer to your faith.
Yeah. But I was very careful when I was involved with these prayer groups to keep my theology more or less high church Episcopal. And for example, I would never receive communion from any minister that I didn't think was ordained in the apostolic succession. So even though I was participating with evangelicals, I was keeping my theological distance from them because I knew that their approach, Bible-only Christianity, was just historically false.
Yeah.
So I continued as an Episcopalian then, and I got married in the chapel at Kenyon to a girl who was an Episcopalian, raised Episcopalian, and then the things came to a head as far as the Catholic Church was concerned in 1976. I had been working as an Episcopal director of religious education in two parishes in Ohio, in Lima and Findlay. And
you had?
Yeah.
Had you sensed a call to ministry?
I sort of thought about it. In fact, I had an experience earlier that I took as God's calling me to the Episcopal ministry, but then I kind of fell away from that. I don't know. It's funny. I think about that sometimes. If I had become an Episcopal minister, then I could have become a priest later on, maybe. But I don't know. It's considering the state of the Episcopal Church at the time, I probably would not have gone on to their ordination because things were falling apart. Yeah. So in 1976, the Episcopal Church, in the fall, the General Convention voted to authorize the ordination of women. And I knew that this was totally contrary to Christian tradition, that, women could not be priests. I mean, Episcopalians don't have priests, but that's the term we used. And in fact, for a while, I even published a little newsletter called the Newsletter on Women's Ordination, which I mailed out to all the Episcopal clergymen in the Diocese of Ohio and to a few others against the ordination of women. And so when
we just got some viewers who said, "You're the guy,"
Well, anybody ever remembers that anymore, but who knows? But anyway, after the Episcopal Church ordained women, I knew we had to do something. We couldn't stay in the Episcopal Church, so what were we going to do? Well, there were basically three choices. There were these breakaway Episcopal churches that were starting up at the time. There was Eastern Orthodoxy, or there was Rome. And just as a pragmatic matter, I thought it made sense to look into Rome first, because you could find a Catholic church almost anywhere, but you couldn't find any of these very many places. It was hard.
Had you had, over the years, had you had much contact with the Catholic Church? Or?
Well, it's funny. When I was an undergraduate, the Catholic parish in Mount Vernon, St. Vincent's, had contacted Kenyon, and they had asked, is there anybody there who would like to sing at a folk mass? And they and the authorities of the college somehow knew about the prayer group that I mentioned before, and there was one very, very skilled guitar player and singer in that prayer group. And they asked us if we wanted to do it. None of us were Catholics. And so for about 3 years, we sang pretty much every Saturday at the folk mass at St. Vincent's in Mount Vernon. Now, I'm not particularly a friend of folk masses nowadays. In fact, I go to the Latin Extraordinary Form Mass. But it did give me a lot of familiarity with going to Catholic church and seeing Catholics. And so, I lost my train of thought here, but.
Well, I was asking about your background.
Yeah, with the Catholic Church, yeah. So that's right. I realized we needed to leave the Episcopal Church, and it made sense to investigate the Catholic Church. And so we started going, my wife and I started going to Mass. We weren't receiving communion, of course, but we were going to Mass. And I'll mention here that one of the benefits of doing this early on was I had been suspicious for a long, long time of contraception. It seemed to me to be an obvious interference with a natural act. And I thought, maybe there's something wrong with this. But I didn't know I thought you only had two choices. Either you used contraceptives or you had 100 children. And there was nothing in between. There was no way to control your fertility if you didn't. And I was frankly afraid of having 100 children, or 20 or whatever. So we saw something in the parish bulletin. This was in Bluffton, St. Mary's in Bluffton, about natural family planning. And I said, we're going to learn this. And so we went to one of the very, very earliest classes of the couple we had in Columbus Grove, and we learned natural family planning, and started using it. And this was about a year before we became Catholics, and that was a barrier to becoming a Catholic, even though it wasn't an intellectual barrier so much as just a moral barrier. Yeah. Because I knew he couldn't be a Catholic and use contraceptives, but I didn't know there was anything to do, any way out of the dilemma as I saw it. So anyway, we started going to Mass, as I said, and then in the fall, actually it was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, we enrolled in a inquiry class, I guess. They didn't have RCIA in those days, at least not in most places. So it was a more informal inquiry class, and we met with a priest weekly. Now, the priest was not Orthodox. He was, he certainly was a dissenter on Humanae Vitae and probably on other things. So, but I knew enough to argue with him. So we went through his class. It wasn't really that good. It didn't really give me what I needed. So at the end of the course, which was about a semester long, I really didn't know what to do. I was really undecided. Now, here is a kind of a stupid thing in me. I had known for years that the key to the question of Rome in the church was, how did the early church look on Rome? How did the fathers look on Rome? And I had actually read, I don't know if you've heard of Francis Hall. He died in, I think, 1934. He was an Episcopal theologian who wrote a 10-volume series of dogmatic theology, sometimes called the Anglican Summa Theologiae. Yeah. And I had read that, and I had learned a lot of good stuff from it. But he had been quite misleading on the question of Rome and the place of Rome in the early church. And even though he was quite industrious finding quotations from the fathers to support high church episcopal positions on, say, sacraments or the visible church or something like that, on the question of Rome, he didn't quote any of the obvious places, and he only quoted that odd, if you're familiar with the Council of Sardis, that appears to be relativizing Rome's claims, but it's kind of an outlier, if you will. So anyway, so it was Christmas of 1977. I actually turned, which I should have done earlier, to the fathers and see what they said. And I was just utterly shocked. When I read, for example, that famous quotation from Irenaeus from the Against the Heresies about how every church must agree with the Church of Rome, then I read St. Cyprian, same kind of thing. And I read a quotation from Tertullian. Now, by that time, he had already left the church. He was a Montanist, but it was witnessing to how people felt about Rome at the time.
Yeah.
And, man, I didn't know this. This is it. So it was open and shut at that point. And so a few weeks later, it was in February of '78, my wife and I were both received into the church.
Would you say that then, so Rome's an issue, and we'll set that aside for a second, but the formation you were receiving in the Episcopal Church as you were doing your reading in pretty much a high church Anglican perspective was preparing you for all the areas of Catholicism and the sacraments and such?
Oh yeah, I mean, really, there are only a couple of ways you can approach Christianity. There's the notion that there's a visible church. And, I suppose anybody can start a visible church and claim, I'm the one true church. But if you don't have any history, it's kind of, you don't have much credibility. So there are only a couple candidates for being the visible church. Basically Rome and Eastern Orthodoxy are about it. And then there's the evangelical Protestant idea that the church is not visible, the church is invisible. Only God knows who the member of the church is, and the various institutions, like, say, the Southern Baptist Convention, are not really the church. They're just institutions, man-made institutions to established to help the gospel and so on.
Yeah.
So that's why you talk to some Protestants sometimes, and they'll say, well, it doesn't really matter what church you believe in, it matters whether you're a Christian, and as if the Catholic Church were just another thing like the Southern Baptist Convention. But I knew that was wrong. I'd known that was wrong since high school, when I read people like Knox and some Anglican writers, that's not how Christianity operated even in the apostolic age. Christianity was not simply an invisible movement, it was a visible church. So the question was, all right, where is that visible church? Well, as an Anglican, I had more or less adhered to that, what I'm sure familiar with, it's called branch theory of the church. Yeah. The idea that there's three branches, co-equal more or less: the Roman branch, the Eastern branch, and the Anglican branch. And they all have valid sacraments and so on. Well, the Episcopal Church, the Episcopal branch had fallen through the floor. So the question was there a true branch? What was the truth? And when I saw the fathers and what they said about Rome, it became obvious that, well, the branch theory was nonsense. There was Rome. That was it. If you wanted to be a Christian according to Christ's intention, then you were going to be in communion with the Church of Rome, with the Bishop of Rome. And that's why, for me, I read a lot of convert stories, and people have trouble with this doctrine or that doctrine, say the Marian doctrines, mm-hmm. or the doctrine of the Eucharist, transubstantiation. That was never an issue for me, not just because of the high church formation that I had received, but because I realized that if Rome was correct, then you adhere to Rome and you adhere to all the authoritative doctrines that Rome had proclaimed. Yeah. The matter of the church comes first, and then the particular doctrines that the church teaches follow as a matter of course.
Yeah. And you're quite a student of history and philosophy and such, far more than me, Thomas, I recognize that. And the one thing that I've recognized in my reading of the history of philosophy, the history of ideas, the history of this history itself, is that throughout history we find good people, sincere people, very intelligent people who get it wrong over and over and over again, which is why the Lord gave us a church guided by the Spirit, because a Tertullian can get it wrong eventually when he decides to turn from the church. Or Arius wasn't a bad guy. There were people that loved Jesus Christ, and they, for whatever reason, decided they figured it out better than the rest. And that's why we have all these different threads. But we have Rome, that we have this path of the church that Christ gave us.
Yeah, it does really give us a solid rock to adhere to and say, well, maybe I don't understand this, maybe I don't understand that, but I do know this, and this is something I can adhere to and something I can build on intellectually, spiritually, in every way. And there's one other thing I should mention, which was going on concomitantly with this intellectual process. It was not at least if I know myself, it was not decisive, but it was a factor. And that I was very attracted to various expressions of Catholicism that I came across. For example, when I was still an Episcopalian, I happened to go to the pilgrimage, which you're probably familiar with, in Cary, Ohio, at the Shrine of Our Lady of Consolation on the Feast of the Assumption.
Yeah.
And there were these Catholics there from all over the place. They were from Iraq, from Italian-speaking Catholics, all kinds of. And I found that just wonderful, because the Episcopal Church was kind of like the upper class of the English-speaking world, and here was the whole world. You know that famous quotation from Joyce, "Here comes everybody." And then I spent some time in Santa Fe, New Mexico, going to graduate school there, and I saw the same thing with Hispanic Catholicism. I was immensely attracted to it, and to the art, to the whole way of life.
Yeah.
It was so that was a pull for me. But I don't think it was decisive. I think the decisive thing was simply realizing, no, if you want to be a Christian, you have to be in union with Rome.
All right, well, let's pause there,
Okay.
Thomas, and we'll come back just a moment and hear more from our guest, Thomas Storck. See you then. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and our guest is Thomas Storck. And just a couple things, as I mentioned earlier, the Coming Home Network has published a book called Journeys Home 2. It's a collection of 30 conversion stories, and Thomas's story is in that book. If you're interested in finding out more about that, you can go to the Coming Home Network website, chnetwork.org. And you have a website, thomasstorck.org, also. A lot of your articles and such connected on that?
Yes, a friend of mine established that website, and his intention is to put up a PDF of everything I've written.
Well, there you go. I mean, it gets it out there. Yeah, and I mentioned earlier to the audience, I know you not so much because of your conversion, which I know that, but because of your other writings, and you've written a lot on Catholic social teaching, what we might call the understanding of distributism, an economics alternative to socialism and capitalism, in line with the teaching of the Church, Rerum Novarum, kind of carried forward, but also Catholic culture, and you have books on that. I want to ask you about Catholic culture. Before I get there, would you say that your writings are a trajectory of your journey? Are they connected to your journey into the faith?
That's a good question, and I don't quite know how to answer it. They certainly are connected with the trajectory of becoming a Catholic, in the sense that I perceive that when you become a Catholic, then you do more, or you should do more than simply change your way of believing and your way of acting, that there are ramifications on the family level and even beyond that, depending on circumstances. This is connected with the idea of Catholic culture. Shortly after my conversion, I don't remember exactly when it was, I came across an essay by a Jesuit by the name of George Bull that was written in the 1930s and published in that journal Thought, which they used to, published in Boston, or no, Fordham, I think, published it. And it was called The Function of the Catholic Graduate School, which might seem like a rather esoteric topic. But Father Bull starts out the essay by saying something like this: we have come in recent years to see from the writings of people like Belloc and Dawson and Maritain that Catholics differ from others, not merely as a matter of beliefs, but in a matter of actions and social actions, and which extends down even to ordinary everyday behavior. And that helped me to see that if you look, for example, why is life different, say, in Spain from Norway? Well, there are a lot of differences. Obviously, climate and things like that affect it. But nonetheless, the fact that Norway abandoned the Catholic faith hundreds of years ago, and Spain only abandoned it relatively recently, the Spanish life has been shaped by the Catholic faith more profoundly than, say, in Norway, or Italian life has been shaped more profoundly. There are differences in the way Catholics behave, not just as individuals, we hope, but on a social level, on a community level, which we might call Catholic culture. I'm using culture here in the anthropological sense, not in the sense of Catholic art or literature, important as that is. I'm talking about Catholic culture as how Catholics behave, how they shape, because our faith is not meant to be simply something that instructs me about correct belief and correct morals. It's meant to be something that, say on a family, it would be absurd to think of a Catholic family in which the whole family life was not shaped by the faith. And this is true if you go to a traditional Catholic village in Europe or Latin America, you'll see that the festivities, the saints' days, observances, the processions, all this is affected by the faith. And my first book, The Catholic Milieu, which was published in 1987, is about basically what a Catholic culture is like. How does that affect? And to me, this is one of the things that is most necessary for Catholics nowadays, perhaps especially Catholics who live in a Protestant culture. I mean, Cardinal George, the late Cardinal George of Chicago, he remarked in 2001, right after the Synod of the Americas, he said, most Catholics in the United States are culturally Calvinists. They're not culturally Protestants. Culturally Catholics, but they're right. Culturally Calvinists. They may believe the Catholic faith, although that's increasingly questionable, but they culturally, they're Calvinists. Well, you might say, well, I don't understand. A lot of people, I think, are puzzled by that. What does it mean to be a cultural Calvinist versus a cultural Catholic? Isn't Catholicism simply a matter of believing the creed and trying to obey the commandments? Well, yes, it's certainly those things. Those are the core of it. But the way we this question of Catholic culture affects everything is quite amazing. It affects art, literature, music, and one of the things that affects most profoundly is economics. Mm-hmm. And that's you asked before about my work with Catholic social teaching. As probably a lot of our listeners know, the Catholic Church has always had teachings about what was right and wrong in the marketplace. These teachings are not just sort of isolated, though. They are part of the whole approach to trying to have a Christian society. Yeah. So, for example, in the Middle Ages, the Church taught and has never repudiated that teaching that usury was wrong. And it was John Calvin who was the first one to come along and say, oh, I think usury is not wrong. It's okay. And that teaching has triumphed, and Calvin's teaching has pretty much triumphed in the modern world. But starting in 1891, Pope Leo, who had set himself a tremendous project to restate Catholic teaching in the face of modernity, one of the encyclicals, he published a whole series of encyclicals about philosophy. Was the first one, because he put first things first, Thomism, and then about the political order, and then about the economic order in Rome and Navarra. Mm-hmm. And starting with that, there's been a whole series of social encyclicals. The most notable ones are those by Pope Pius XI, who reigned from 1922 to 1939. And Quadragesimo Anno is a marvelous, incredibly marvelous work. And in fact, the formal title of the encyclical is about restoring society according to the gospel, according to the Christian teaching. I mean, it's a program an immense program for reshaping the world, which Catholics have never really faced up to our duty in this respect. But anyway, in these encyclicals, you will find, while you won't find detailed prescriptions for a lot of things, no, they're meant to be general principles by and large, you will find an orientation toward economic activity and economic thinking, which is unusual in the world today. It rejects certainly communism, it rejects socialism, but it also rejects the idea of the free market, the idea that the market is a regulatory principle sufficient unto itself. It doesn't reject private property, of course, but a lot of people think that, well, if you're in favor of private property, then you must be in favor of the free market. But actually, the free market can even act as an enemy of private property, because property tends to accumulate in the hands of those with more power, those with more money, and those without money or power find themselves bereft of property. Now, in England, in the starting around the time of the First World War, there was a movement called distributism, which was an attempt to apply Catholic social teaching. I'm sure you know Hilaire Belloc, G.K. Chesterton were the most well-known expositors of this movement. And I've been involved with distributism for a number of years. I write for a couple of distributist websites, the Distributist Review and Practical Distributism. And distributism is basically, as I said, an attempt to apply Catholic social teaching. It upholds very strongly the principle of private property, but it realizes that private property does not exist in a vacuum. It exists for a purpose, just like the economy exists for a purpose to supply and nurture human life. It's not the other way around. Somebody quipped that under capitalism, free market capitalism, society is an adjunct of the market. Well, it should be the other way around. The market should be an adjunct of society because the market exists to serve society, not vice versa.
Yeah. And it's when you live in the soup of free market capitalism, it's sometimes hard to see other options, and that's tough. And I've tried to figure out how to explain this and give you a chance on television to show where I'm wrong on this, to try and how to address how our different perspectives really change life. If you take a wedding band, if you understand marriage as permanent, then this wedding band is not an investment. If I look at a wedding band as it's an investment that I can sell in 5 years and make more money because it's increased in value, not only does that give me a different perspective of the wedding band, it changes how I understand marriage. And the same thing with the home. Is this house, I'm buying this house for my family to live in and my children to have after it, or am I only looking at a home as an investment? Two radically different ideas that shape the family.
Exactly. And if you think of the house as an investment, you're probably thinking of the community as merely a temporary stopping point. You know, you have no roots there. You don't want to put down roots, and but you'll stay there as long as it's convenient for you. But the problem is that we have forces coming at us from every side which promote this view of life, this rootless view of life, so that a lot of people they lose their job and they have to move. Well, it's not their fault they lost their job, so they have to move and sell their house. And maybe they would prefer to stay in the community where they have roots, where they have an extended family, where they so. But the economy dictates, no, you've got to move, and that it's very hard to solve these problems on an individual level. That's why back in the 1920s and 1930s, when Catholics were there, during the reign of Pius XI, who was really interested in the social apostolate, there was a lot of consciousness on the part of Catholics as to Catholic social teaching and what it implied for living and for even on the political order. And so Catholics then tended to be much more conscious of this. In fact, I'm reading right now a book by Fulton Sheen called Justice and Charity. That was a series of radio talks he published he gave in 1938. And his critiques of economics are so incredibly hard-hitting today. If I could probably find a quotation in there, and you say, "Oh, that must have been by a socialist." No, it wasn't by a socialist. By Fulton Sheen. But he was applying the teaching of Pope Pius to current reality. So you really need the first step. I always say, people will ask me, "What should you do? What can I do?" And I say, "Well, there's things you can do on your own level and on your family's level, and that's good. But the first step to any kind of change is going to have to be a consciousness on the part of Catholics, including the hierarchy and our clergy, of that the Church has something to say on this subject. That we do have a unique, distinct method, or doctrine, I should say, and it goes back to the question of Catholic identity. Catholics. Right now, it seems to me that Catholics are identifying, well, I'm a conservative or I'm a liberal, meaning part of a larger movement. Well, no, those are both, I think, wrong. What we should say is, I'm a Catholic. I'm a Catholic, and I try to shape all my thinking on every subject by the teaching of the Church, so that when the Church happens to agree with conservatives, for example, on abortion, fine. When the Church might agree with liberals, say on support of unions, fine. But I'm doing it not because I'm a liberal or not because I'm a conservative, but because I'm a Catholic.
I'm wondering if we think about the timeline, which you've written about in your books, when Rerum Novarum was written, 1890, I think.
1891.
1891, under Leo XIII. Yeah, Leo XIII. Coming through our era of depression in the 20s, 30s, and how families survived during that time, and then now into the soup that we're in today, here in the 21st century. I'm wondering what place the understanding of simplicity as an important aspect of living the Catholic gospel is important to this understanding of this Catholic social teaching, because we're in a soup today of such economic growth, if you want to say it, or affluence, that we've accepted things in our life that we think are necessary, that our great-great-grandparents would never even dreamed of having in their life, because they had accepted a more simple way of life as a normal part of life. Now it becomes a great sacrifice, and I think that's part of the reason why it's hard for us to imagine a different system of living, because of what we're living in.
Yeah, the imperative of continue. I mean, there's nothing wrong per se with technology, and there's nothing wrong per se with technological development. But that doesn't mean that every technological development is socially good, or that the rapidity of technological development has been good for society. I mean, I think just in terms of electronic devices, I think since I was born in 1951, and what we've gone through, the old photographs, and then stereos, and then reel-to-reel tape players, and cassettes and everything. And sometimes you have the record collection, you're going to throw it out because you can't find a machine to play it anymore, or a good machine. What a waste! What an incredible waste! And sometimes these changes are improvements, sometimes they're not. But the imperative toward rapid technological development I think has been deleterious to human life. In Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, and Twain was profoundly Protestant in his culture, although not in his beliefs, but he really had his critique of Catholicism was so extreme that even H.L. Mencken criticized him for it. But anyway, in the Protestant, in the Connecticut Yankee, he said, the first thing you want to do to make this backward old Catholic society of the King Arthur, you want to give them a patent law. Then they'll have new inventions all the time. and so we have lots of artificial stimuli to inventions, and there's nothing wrong with a gradual increase in complexity of technology, but too rapid an increase is a destabilizing factor in society. Yes.
And to what extent it defines who we are and what our family is by the technologies which change, and it gets increasingly difficult to break free from them. It's like you were talking about when you were struggling with the issue of contraception. When you're in a contraceptive society, it's a radical step to take a step out of that, because everybody's doing it, everybody thinks it's accepting, everybody's pushing it at you, because this technology now has become so easy for us. And it doesn't just change an act; it changes a family, it changes a marriage. And
yeah, when you see younger people and their interaction with electronic devices, sometimes it's quite amazing for me to think, well, wait a minute, I hardly ever use a cell phone, but some people seem to be wedded to it, inseparable.
Yeah. I've got an email. Charles from the West Coast writes, Mr. Storck, what do you consider some important principles of Catholic thought that, I think he means, need to be rediscovered and emphasized in today's culture?
Well, I would say there are so many, but there are two maybe primary ones. One is the idea that Catholicism is a community religion. we are a part of a community of the church, which extends in both place and time, and it's not an individualistic religion. We have to try to incarnate, if you will, Catholicism on the family level, on the community level, and it would be nice, ultimately, on the national level. And then one of the major aspects of that is the critique of the economic system. The economic system is not something that we can just leave. So well, that's the devil. It has its own principles. We don't worry about that. Just go to Mass and be good. No, we have the church has always had a profound critique ever since the New Testament, and even before in the Jewish community, the Old Testament community there was. If you look back on Moses, 5 books of Moses, tremendous number of laws about all kinds of things, about property rights, about restoration of property in the Jubilee year. So the church, God speaking through the church, has always had a critique of the social order. And to say that is not to become a socialist or a communist. To say that is simply to be a Catholic.
Yeah. There's a line in the Mass that always strikes me because it is such it's a Catholic way of understanding the faith compared to my Protestant. And it's when the priest prays, "Do not look on my sins, but on the faith of the church."
Yeah.
The community of the church. It isn't just me and Jesus. Yes, it is our personal relationship with Christ, which is essential, but it's as a part of the family, a part of the community.
Yeah, and if you look back, I mean, historically, when the church transformed Europe, the Catholic civilization, Christendom, that came into existence, 5th, 6th centuries and lasted up until it began to decline in the 16th century, profoundly shaped every aspect of life. Not just going to Mass and avoiding, breaking the Ten Commandments, but for example, in economics, there were the Catholic guilds, which attempted to orient economic life toward reasonable production for people's genuine needs, as well as a reasonable remuneration for the worker.
Now, I think you said there were 2 social teachings you thought. The one was the group
community, and then the other was the application of that to the economic order.
Oh, okay, which does take a group. It's hard as on our own.
It does, and it's probably and it needs to be emphasized because otherwise people are apt to forget it, I think.
Another email, Terrence from Glendale. As Americans, sometimes it seems like we compartmentalize our faith and our involvement in society. How should one's religious beliefs influence and instruct our efforts in the secular world?
Well, it should be determinative. I mean, as we should try to make all our actions in every sphere of life consonant, not only consonant with the Catholic faith, but taking its origin from the Catholic faith, and that requires study. That requires knowing what the Church says. You're probably not going to get that just going to Mass and hearing a homily every week. You're going to need to study, what does the Church say about this? And there's an immense amount of literature out there, both old and new. The 1930s was a really rich time for Catholics writing in this area.
Yeah, and I was a wonderful book I read printed at the end of 1940 by Monsignor Luigi, who you probably read his stuff, was talking about applying these very principles to our economics in America. He had a whole plan laid out on how he could help poor families instead of being on the rolls of the government to go out and get an acre of land. And of course, the thing is, just when his book is printed, Pearl Harbor happens, and now we have the solution for America's problems. Is everybody's work building bombs.
Yeah. World War II profoundly changed things, both in the United States and Europe, because of the. It seemed to people then that there were only 2 alternatives: either Soviet communism or bourgeois American capitalism, and Catholics, I think, were kind of afraid to raise their voice and say, "Oh, wait a minute, we have something else. We have a third way," or there's not just 2. And I know that among a number of European Catholic thinkers that had been in the 30s quite notable for pushing Catholic teachings kind of faded into the background or muted their voices in the 50s.
Yeah, because it's not easy to explain in a paragraph or 2.
And we seemed so prosperous then. that there wasn't, it was like, well, we don't need this. We don't need this anymore. The Depression is over.
Yeah, well, Thomas, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. And for your writings, again, thomasstorck.org if you want to find out more about what Thomas has written. What a great pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you.
It's good to see you
inviting
again.
me.
And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I pray that Thomas's journey, as well as some of his thoughts about Catholic social teaching, have been encouragement to you. God bless you. See you again next week.